Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the peculiar world of Victorian insomnia. Picture yourself in a dimly lit, gaslit bedroom where the faint tick of a clock on the wall is the only sound accompanying your restless mind. You're not alone in this sleepless struggle. In fact, insomnia was a widespread epidemic during the Victorian era, and millions of people were wrestling with the same issue. You probably won't survive this if you're hoping for a peaceful night's sleep, because the solutions they came up with, well, let's just say they're a bit unusual. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're from a place where insomnia still lingers, drop your location and local time in the comments, and I'll keep you company while you drift off. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the 19th century, sleeplessness wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a medical mystery. The problem was so rampant that in some circles it became a sign of high society's fragility. People of all social classes were affected, but the upper crust had the worst cases. They had too much time to think about their problems, after all. For those who couldn't find solace in sleep, the quest for a cure became a near obsession. Doctors, chemists, and even spiritualists all tried their hand at fixing this widespread issue. Sleep in the Victorian age wasn't the peaceful retreat we imagine today. It was often seen as a time for healing, for rejuvenation, and, for some, even a luxury. But as it became elusive, the remedies grew stranger and stranger. The medical community was still figuring out the basics of sleep cycles and disorders, and some solutions they proposed were as bizarre as they were ineffective. From opium-laced tonics to fainting as a therapy, Victorian society was willing to try anything to induce sleep. The struggle to cure insomnia led to the invention of a peculiar new form of medical institution, the sleep clinic. These clinics were the Victorian answer to the modern-day sleep disorder treatment centers, but with one crucial difference. The remedies they prescribed often sounded more like a recipe for disaster than a solution. Instead of just lying down in a comfortable bed to rest, patients were subjected to odd concoctions of treatments meant to reboot their sleep cycle. Some of these sleep clinics were set up by prominent doctors of the day, while others had more of a spiritual or quackish angle, where remedies could include everything from hypnotism to being put in a sleep chamber for days at a time. One of the most commonly recommended treatments was something that might make you cringe, a regimented rest cure. Now, you might imagine a quiet, peaceful retreat where one could sleep soundly for days on end. But this was not the case. No, the rest cure was more like a prison sentence for your mind. Imagine being told you must stay in bed for weeks without any stimulating activities, no reading, no writing, no socializing. You would lie in bed for days in a quiet room, forced to surrender to an endless loop of your own thoughts. Of course, this forced inactivity did nothing to ease the restless minds of insomnia sufferers. But it was the treatment of the time, advocated by the famous Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, who treated the upper-class women in particular. Historians still argue whether these rest cures were actually effective or if they merely provided a temporary distraction from life's stresses. In any case, the silence and isolation didn't seem to lead to better sleep. In fact, they likely increased the anxiety that many of these patients were already suffering from. Imagine, if you will, lying there, day after day, thinking only about how much you wanted to sleep, and not being able to do so. Some patients even reported that their insomnia grew worse during the rest cure. But Victorian society was so focused on the need to rest that they didn't have the luxury of questioning whether this approach was actually harmful to the mental health of the patients. Despite the unfortunate effects, the idea of rest curing, however ineffective, led to the rise of specialized rest homes. These became a fashionable way for the wealthy to escape the stresses of their often hectic lives. Whether it helped sleep or not, these rest homes provided an opportunity for people to retreat from the hustle and bustle and reestablish their health, or at least that was the hope. Yet, as you can imagine, the rest cure was no cure at all for those battling insomnia. One of the most widely known and widely used treatments for insomnia in the Victorian era was opium. Yes, opium, the very substance that would later become the cause of much social and medical upheaval, was considered a perfectly acceptable remedy for sleeplessness during this time. It was often consumed in the form of laudanum, a tincture that was made by dissolving opium in alcohol. Sounds relaxing, doesn't it? If you were living in the Victorian age and suffering from insomnia, you might be prescribed this powerful sedative, promising that a few drops would carry you off to sleep. In fact, laudanum was often marketed as a cure-all for a range of ailments, from nervousness to digestive issues. But the truth was far more complicated than that. Yes, laudanum could help people fall asleep, but it did so at a cost. Addiction to opium was rampant among those who used laudanum regularly, and the effects could be devastating. The Victorians, however, were largely oblivious to the dangers of addiction, at least until it was far too late. Even medical professionals, many of whom were more concerned with immediate relief than long-term consequences, recommended laudanum for insomnia without thinking much about its addictive properties. Interestingly, while laudanum was widely used, there was still a great deal of debate within medical circles about its safety and efficacy. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of opium in Victorian society was simply a product of ignorance, or whether it reflected a deeper societal acceptance of substances that helped people manage pain or discomfort in an era with few other options. What we do know is that for many, laudanum was a temporary solution, masking the deeper issues at play: stress, anxiety, and the overwhelming pressure of Victorian life. And as you might imagine, this quick fix didn't do much to help the insomniac once the drug wore off. In fact, it often left them feeling more restless and anxious, seeking their next dose. On the lighter side, some of the most extravagant treatments for insomnia involve the use of opium-laced confectionaries, like opium chocolates. Imagine being able to satisfy your sweet tooth and fall asleep all at once. It sounds like a dream, but it's no surprise that many of these sugary, opium-infused treats had a dark side. Over time, as the risks of opium use became more apparent, these treatments fell out of favor, replaced by other, equally bizarre remedies. Now, if opium was the heavy artillery of Victorian insomnia treatments, there were far more delicate, yet equally peculiar solutions to the sleep problem. One of the more luxurious and somewhat bizarre remedies for sleeplessness was the idea of sleepwear. But we're not talking about the simple cotton pajamas you're probably familiar with. No, the wealthy elite of the Victorian era had an entirely different approach to bedtime attire. From elaborate nightgowns to velvet sleep caps adorned with lace, they believed that sleepwear could play a significant role in encouraging good sleep. You might think it sounds frivolous, but the wealthy Victorian class, with its obsession for status and refinement, didn't take any aspect of life lightly, especially when it came to sleep. For them, wearing the right sleepwear was as important as any medicine. These garments weren't just about comfort either. They were designed to promote health, calm, and relaxation. For example, velvet was often thought to have soothing properties, while lace was associated with the gentility and delicacy expected of upper-class women. Historians still argue whether these fine materials truly had any impact on sleep quality, or if they were just another form of social signaling. Was it the velvet against the skin that lulled someone to sleep, or the sheer indulgence of being able to afford such luxurious fabric? Whatever the case, there's no denying that for many Victorians, sleep was as much a societal ritual as it was a biological necessity. And if you could afford it, dressing for sleep in fine silks, velvets, and satins became just another way to signal wealth and status, even in your most private moments. On the more eccentric side of the Victorian sleepwear trend, some people believed that wearing certain nightcaps, often padded and embroidered, could help prevent nightmares or even improve sleep quality. One theory suggested that the snug, comforting fit of a well-designed nightcap might provide the wearer with a sense of security and warmth, which in turn could help them relax enough to sleep. Imagine wrapping yourself in layers of fabric and donning a padded nightcap, all in the name of sleep. But while these sleepwear trends may seem outlandish today, they weren't just about luxury. They were a reflection of Victorian anxieties around health, wellness, and the proper way to live. To them, even the act of sleeping required a certain level of refinement and care. So next time you slip into your cozy pajamas, remember that the Victorians would probably raise an eyebrow at your lack of lace, velvet, and embroidered nightcaps. Let's move on from the fashion-forward world of Victorian sleepwear and talk about something that sounds a little more medicinal: sleeping drafts. These potions were commonly prescribed to help insomnia sufferers drift into a peaceful slumber. But in true Victorian fashion, their concoctions often ranged from the bizarre to the outright dangerous. A sleeping draught wasn't just a glass of warm milk or a calming tea. No, these remedies were often filled with potent ingredients that would make your modern pharmacist cringe. Victorians had an almost obsessive belief in the power of these herbal and chemical concoctions. Many sleeping draughts contained a mixture of herbs like valerian root, which was thought to calm the nerves, and chamomile, which was known for its mild sedative properties. But these weren't the only ingredients. Many sleeping draughts were laced with alcohol and even opium, the latter being a common sleep aid during this time. And if that wasn't enough, some of these remedies also contained extracts from the most unexpected sources, like animal tissues or even mineral oils. Imagine being told to drink something that included crushed up snake skin or ground up minerals for a better night's sleep. Historians still argue whether these strange brews had any real effect on sleep quality, or if they simply provided a placebo effect. The alcohol in many of these drafts certainly helped people relax and feel sleepy, but the long-term side effects, ranging from addiction to liver damage, were rarely considered by the users. Some medical professionals of the time believed that a sleeping draught, if taken regularly, could train the body to fall asleep more easily, while others were skeptical of its long-term benefits. While these potent draughts might have been effective, for some, the problem was that they often led to a pattern of dependency. People would find themselves unable to sleep without their nightly dose of laudanum or alcohol-laced tonic. It wasn't uncommon for patients to start off using the sleeping potion as a short-term solution, only to become reliant on it over time. The Victorian era, with its rapid industrialization and increasing pressures on both physical and mental health, saw a sharp rise in substance dependence. What began as an innocent attempt to manage sleeplessness soon turned into a widespread addiction problem. Though these remedies have long since fallen out of favor, they serve as a stark reminder of the lengths to which people will go in the pursuit of a good night's sleep. Whether you were rich or poor in Victorian society, sleep was considered vital to your health, and getting it often meant going to extremes. In addition to these heavy-duty sleeping draughts, there was another, more delicate remedy that became quite popular in Victorian households: lavender. Ah, lavender, the soft, sweet-smelling herb that we all associate with relaxation today. But did you know that Victorians took their lavender very seriously when it came to sleep? It was one of the most widely used remedies to soothe the nerves and encourage restful slumber. But the obsession with lavender wasn't just limited to a sprig tucked under the pillow. It was used in all sorts of forms: oil, tea, and even tucked into sachets, which were then placed in bedding, wardrobes, or even inside nightcaps. Lavender was believed to have a magical calming effect, and while it might sound like a lovely, peaceful solution, the Victorian obsession with lavender bordered on the excessive. Some wealthy households would go so far as to commission lavender-scented wallpaper, creating a constant infusion of calming scents in their homes. Picture it, stepping into a drawing room, gently swaying in the breeze as lavender aromas permeate every corner. For the Victorians, sleep was a science, and lavender was their formula. Historians still argue whether lavender actually had any sedative effects, or if its use was simply part of a broader cultural obsession with natural remedies. While we know that lavender has calming properties, the Victorians believed it could work magic, almost as if you could smell your way to sleep. Some doctors even believed that placing lavender under your pillow would promote lucid dreaming, although modern sleep science would definitely raise an eyebrow at that. But the use of lavender wasn't restricted to the rich. Even the working class had their own form of lavender-induced relaxation. Lavender was mixed into inexpensive lotions or oils, applied to the skin to soothe and relax before bed. Some would even brew it into a calming tea, while others filled their bath water with the soothing scent of the herb. The result? A nation filled with lavender-scented dreams. While it was certainly much gentler than opium or alcohol-based remedies, lavender's popularity highlights how desperate the Victorians were for a solution to their sleeplessness. Perhaps the most fascinating use of lavender, however, was its employment as a sleep-inducing atmosphere. In an age before aromatherapy had reached the modern recognition it enjoys today, the Victorians used it to manipulate their environments in ways we'd find quite charming today. They believed that simply surrounding themselves with lavender would automatically send them into a peaceful slumber, even if the underlying issues of anxiety or stress were still there. It was a passive form of sleep therapy. Let the lavender do its work and eventually you'd drift off. While lavender was a peaceful, almost poetic solution for insomnia, the Victorians also found themselves turning to something far more dramatic: fainting. Yes, you read that correctly. Fainting as a form of treatment for insomnia. Now, before you start imagining dramatic swoons and collapsing couches, let me explain. The fainting craze was a peculiar chapter in Victorian medical history, where fainting spells were believed to have therapeutic effects on those suffering from excessive stress or insomnia. The idea was that fainting would somehow reset the nervous system, helping people relax and eventually fall into a deep, restorative sleep. It might sound absurd to us today, but in Victorian society, fainting was far more than just a theatrical gesture. It became something of a health trend among women in particular, who were thought to be delicate and prone to emotional and physical collapse. To faint, or to experience a spell of dizziness that could lead to temporary unconsciousness, was considered a way to release pent-up stress and emotional burdens. In fact, fainting spells were often seen as a sign of emotional depth or sensitivity, especially for women in the upper classes. For a woman to faint gracefully in a drawing room was almost a sign of her refined nature, as if she was too fragile for the harshness of life. Historians still argue whether fainting as a cure for insomnia was genuinely helpful or just a socially accepted way for people to avoid the real issue of mental health during this period. On one hand, it was a temporary fix. Fainting would offer a brief escape from the stresses of daily life, a way to momentarily disconnect from the constant pressure to conform to societal expectations. But on the other hand, relying on fainting as a sleep aid didn't address the root causes of insomnia, such as anxiety, depression, and the overall pressures of Victorian life. Some doctors prescribed fainting as a therapeutic remedy, believing that by encouraging the patient to faint, they could shock the body into a state of relaxation. The fainting was often induced by the application of smelling salts or by simply allowing the person to breathe in a series of calming herbs, which would cause them to swoon. For many, the idea of fainting seemed to offer a temporary escape from the overwhelming expectations of their daily lives. But unfortunately, it wasn't a sustainable solution to the insomnia that plagued so many Victorians. In addition to the physical effects of fainting, there was the social element. Fainting could be performed with dramatic flair. Victorian society loved spectacle, and fainting had its own form of theatricality. Fainting couches and armchairs were even designed specifically for these moments of fragility. But in the long run, fainting as a cure for insomnia didn't work. For most, leaving many of the Victorian population to look for the next strange remedy. As we move further into the curious world of Victorian sleep remedies, we come across one of the more eccentric but surprisingly influential practices, the rest cure in seclusion. This wasn't just any form of isolation. It was an entire lifestyle designed to combat the effects of overwork, stress, and sleeplessness. Popularized by the famous physician Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, the rest cure became a well-known treatment among the Victorian upper class, especially for women. The idea was simple, yet harsh. To recover from the emotional and physical toll of modern life, you needed to completely withdraw from the world and rest in total isolation. So, what did this rest entail? Patients were often sent to remote country houses or sequestered in luxurious, isolated rooms where they were told to remain in bed for days, even weeks, with minimal stimulation. No books, no writing, no visitors, nothing that could excite the nerves. The patient's daily routine was reduced to the most basic activities: eating simple meals, sleeping, and lying still. All social and mental engagements were forbidden. Patients were essentially placed in a self-imposed prison of their own thoughts, under the belief that this forced inactivity would help them recover. The rest cure was particularly targeted at women who were seen as delicate creatures prone to mental exhaustion. In an era when gender roles were rigidly defined, many women were expected to be dutiful wives and mothers, all while navigating a society that didn't prioritize their mental health. As a result, the rest cure was sold as a way for women to reclaim their health and vitality, offering them a chance to retreat from their demanding domestic roles. However, the cure often had unintended consequences. Many patients found themselves even more anxious and isolated by the treatment, their insomnia becoming exacerbated by the forced confinement. Historians still argue whether the rest cure was beneficial or whether it was merely a form of control, reinforcing gender norms of the time. Did it help restore health, or did it stifle the agency of its patients? The rest cure is an interesting case study in the intersection of medicine and social control. Some women found temporary relief from their stress, but the long-term effects were questionable. It's worth noting that famous writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who herself underwent the rest cure, famously wrote The Yellow Wallpaper, a short story that critiques this very practice. In the story, the protagonist's rest cure worsens her mental health, as she is trapped in a room with nothing but the pattern of the wallpaper to focus on, leading her to descend further into madness. The rest cure wasn't universally successful, and many found themselves emerging from their seclusion, not cured, but more vulnerable. Nevertheless, the practice became a symbol of the lengths to which the Victorians went in their attempts to treat insomnia and mental fatigue, often with questionable results. Let's step into the world of early electrotherapy. Yes, electricity. You might be surprised to hear that Victorian doctors were experimenting with electricity to treat insomnia, but it was one of the more futuristic ideas of the time. The use of electrical currents to treat medical issues was still in its infancy, but it intrigued many people, especially those suffering from insomnia. Some thought that the gentle shocks could help stimulate the nervous system, while others believed it could reset the body's rhythms to promote better sleep. Either way, the concept of electricity as a therapeutic tool was starting to gain traction, and the Victorians were ready to embrace it. The treatments varied greatly, but one of the most common methods involved a device known as the electromagnetic bed. Patients would lie on a special mattress that had wires running through it connected to an electrical current. The idea was that the slight electrical stimulation would relax the body and promote deep sleep. Of course, this sounds quite a bit like something you'd find in a sci-fi movie, but for the Victorians, it was cutting-edge technology. The electrical currents were not strong enough to cause pain, but they did create a tingling sensation in the body, which some people found oddly soothing. Others, however, were less convinced of its effectiveness, and reports of patients feeling more awake or jittery after the treatment weren't uncommon. Historians still argue whether early electrotherapy was a legitimate form of treatment or simply another fad. While the technology wasn't as advanced as it is today, it's clear that electricity had an undeniable allure. Some modern scientists suggest that the early use of electricity in medical treatments, while somewhat crude, did lay the groundwork for our current understanding of neurological stimulation therapies. But back then, people had little concept of the long-term effects that such treatments could have on their health. And as with many other Victorian remedies, the risks were often ignored in the pursuit of a quick fix. In addition to the magnetic beds, another popular form of electrotherapy was the use of electrical baths. Patients would step into a bath filled with water that was electrified by electrodes, and the idea was that the electrical current would be absorbed through the skin, promoting relaxation. While this may sound completely alien to us, it was a treatment that was embraced by both the wealthy and the more experimental members of society. But of course, not everyone was on board with these electrical treatments. Many Victorian doctors and patients alike viewed electrotherapy with a healthy dose of skepticism. Could something as simple as electricity really be the solution to insomnia? Or was it just another way for people to waste their money on yet another questionable remedy? Whatever the case, electrotherapy remained one of the stranger experiments in the long list of Victorian sleep treatments. If you've been following the peculiar paths of Victorian sleep remedies so far, you might be wondering if there was any simpler, or at least more natural solution to the problem of insomnia. Well, there was one more method that made its rounds during the Victorian era, the idea of sleeping in the countryside. The Victorians, with their penchant for romanticizing nature, believed that escaping to the countryside could work wonders on both the body and mind. Far away from the clatter of city life, the countryside was seen as the ultimate antidote to insomnia and stress. The belief was that the fresh air, quiet environment, and natural surroundings could help reset the nervous system, promote relaxation, and, most importantly, restore a proper sleep cycle. But unlike the rest cures, which were often isolating and strict, these rural retreats were much more flexible. Patients who couldn't sleep were encouraged to leave their busy urban lives behind and spend weeks, sometimes months, in a country estate. These retreats weren't just about being in nature, they were a carefully curated experience, filled with long walks through fields, wholesome meals, and of course, abundant opportunities to nap under the trees or by a bubbling brook. Historians still argue whether these countryside retreats were actually beneficial for insomnia sufferers, or whether the calming effects were simply the result of a psychological placebo. After all, the Victorians' belief in the restorative powers of nature was firmly rooted in the Romantic movement, which idealized rural life and nature as pure and restorative. Nature, in the minds of the Victorians, had a magical quality that could cure the ills of city life, everything from physical fatigue to emotional burnout. It's easy to see how this belief would shape their approach to sleep. Rather than turning to chemical remedies or extreme isolation, they turned to the tranquility of the natural world for solace. However, the countryside retreat wasn't without its contradictions. While the fresh air and relaxation could indeed help many people sleep better, the overemphasis on nature as the ultimate cure for insomnia sometimes overlooked the deeper social and psychological factors that were contributing to the sleeplessness in the first place. After all, Victorian life was filled with pressure on women to be perfect wives, on men to perform well in the workplace, and on everyone to maintain a certain level of decorum. Escaping to nature might have been a temporary fix, but it wasn't. All was a long-term solution to the deep-seated stresses that caused insomnia. The real charm of these countryside retreats wasn't necessarily the sleep they promised, but the lifestyle they represented, a return to simplicity, a step away from the frenetic pace of industrialization, and a chance to breathe and take things slow for a while. And for those who could afford it, this period of pastoral peace was a beautiful, albeit short-lived, reprieve. The rise of sleep doctors in the Victorian era is a fascinating chapter in the history of insomnia treatments. With the increasing prevalence of sleep disorders and the growing public awareness of mental health, a new breed of medical professionals began to emerge, those who specialized solely in the treatment of sleep. These sleep doctors, often eccentric and highly specialized, became the go-to experts for the wealthy who could afford such a personalized approach to their insomnia. But what did these sleep specialists actually do? Some of the most famous sleep doctors were highly regarded figures in the Victorian medical community, but their methods were often strange by modern standards. One of the most famous treatments prescribed by these doctors involved intricate sleep rituals, where the patient was carefully coached on how to prepare for sleep. These rituals might involve specific breathing exercises, visualizations, or even a particular type of lighting in the room. The idea was that sleep could be trained like any other skill, and the doctor's role was to guide the patient through the process of entering a deep, restorative sleep. Historians still debate whether these sleep doctors were truly pioneering a helpful field of medicine, or whether they were simply cashing in on the anxieties of the time. Some of their treatments were based on solid scientific principles, like the use of hypnosis or relaxation techniques, while others were rooted more in superstition and quackery. Regardless, the popularity of sleep doctors highlights just how deeply Victorian society was invested in solving the problem of insomnia. For some, these specialists seemed to offer a level of care that went beyond simple pharmacological treatments. But for others, the doctor's bedside manner was more important than the actual treatment. Many of these professionals became just as famous for their personal charisma as for their medical expertise. Interestingly, some of the more unconventional sleep specialists became infamous for their extreme methods. There were reports of doctors who would lock patients in sleep chambers, designed to create an environment that would supposedly promote deep sleep, complete with controlled lighting, temperature, and sound levels. Others recommended unconventional therapies like being lightly shocked with electricity, another nod to the rise of electrotherapy, or using hypnotic suggestion to induce sleep. These doctors, while gaining followers, were often met with criticism and skepticism from the broader medical community. But despite the sometimes outlandish nature of these treatments, sleep doctors were seen as legitimate experts in an era when sleep disorders were poorly understood. Today, we might look back at their methods with a mix of amusement and disbelief, but at the time, they were the ones leading the charge to help people achieve restful sleep. Their legacy remains in the modern field of sleep medicine, which has evolved into a much more scientifically grounded discipline. But their strange approaches were a necessary stepping stone in understanding the complex relationship between sleep and health. If you thought Victorian medicine's response to insomnia couldn't get any stranger, let's talk about the role of caffeine in all of this. Yes, that familiar, comforting cup of coffee or tea, which many of us rely on to wake up and start. Our day was also at the center of the Victorian sleep crisis. The paradox of caffeine in the Victorian era is that while it's commonly associated with alertness, it was also seen as a remedy for sleeplessness. The problem? Victorians didn't always understand the stimulating effects of caffeine the way we do today. The middle and upper classes, particularly in urban areas, consumed coffee and tea in massive quantities, sometimes in the belief that these caffeinated beverages could actually help regulate sleep patterns. Of course, as we know now, drinking coffee or strong tea late in the day is about as helpful for sleep as trying to fall asleep with a drumline next to your pillow. However, in the Victorian world, caffeine was also thought to wake up the nervous system and help counteract the fatigue that contributed to sleeplessness. So while caffeine's stimulating effects are well known today, the Victorians somehow believed that a cup of tea could be both a stimulant and a remedy for tiredness and insomnia. Historians still argue whether the overconsumption of caffeine contributed to the insomnia epidemic or whether the Victorians were simply unaware of how it affected their bodies. Some have suggested that the high caffeine intake of the time, especially among the upper classes, was a factor in the rise of sleep disorders. After all, it wasn't uncommon for Victorians to drink several cups of strong tea or coffee per day, and they often consumed these beverages at all hours of the day and night, hoping that it would somehow calm their nerves or provide the boost they needed to function. But there's no denying that the effects of caffeine on the Victorian population were paradoxical. On one hand, they drank it to stave off fatigue and promote alertness, while on the other hand, they were struggling with widespread sleep disorders. While we might think of coffee as the go-to morning drink today, the Victorians had an even deeper relationship with caffeine. The obsession with both the social ritual of tea drinking and the perceived health benefits of caffeine created a confusing mix of intentions. Was it a sleep remedy, a pick-me-up, a social event? The reality is that Victorians were relying heavily on caffeine to manage their lives and combat fatigue, not realizing that this same stimulant was quietly contributing to the problem of sleeplessness. For those seeking more restful sleep, the advice to cut back on caffeine might have been revolutionary. But of course, telling a Victorian to stop drinking tea would have been about as effective as telling someone today to stop drinking their morning coffee, an unthinkable task. So, while caffeine certainly didn't help their insomnia, it became yet another layer of the intricate and sometimes baffling web of treatments they tried in their desperate search for rest. The idea of pre-sleep rituals became a significant aspect of Victorian attempts to cure insomnia. The upper classes in particular believed that establishing a set of rituals before bed could guarantee a peaceful night's rest. This wasn't just about brushing your teeth and turning off the light. It was a carefully curated process meant to align the body and mind for sleep. Victorian families who had the time and means created these elaborate bedtime routines, often starting hours before actually getting into bed, for example. It wasn't uncommon for the wealthy to indulge in an evening bath, followed by the application of soothing lotions or oils like lavender or rosewater, known for their calming properties. The idea was that a warm bath would relax the muscles. The oils would soothe the mind, and by the time you actually climbed into bed, you'd be ready to drift off. For many, this ritual was not just about hygiene. It was a therapeutic practice that was believed to prepare the body for deep restorative sleep. Historians still debate whether these rituals were truly effective, or if they merely offered a temporary placebo effect. Was the act of carefully preparing oneself for sleep enough to calm the body, or was it simply a comforting routine that gave people the illusion of control over something as uncontrollable as their sleep? While many modern sleep experts would argue that creating a calm environment and relaxing routine can indeed promote better sleep, the Victorian obsession with ritualism was likely influenced by their overall cultural need for structure and predictability. Interestingly, these bedtime rituals weren't confined to the wealthier classes. Even the middle class adopted their own versions of these rituals. though with a less extravagant flair. For example, some might have relied on simpler, more affordable remedies like a cup of warm milk or a light massage before bed, but no matter how elaborate or simple, these routines were seen as an essential part of the nightly process. They were believed to be an anchor, a steady rhythm that helped guide the body into sleep. And there was an underlying belief that a disturbed ritual would result in a disturbed night's sleep. But the question remains, did these bedtime rituals actually work, or were they just a placebo? Could the simple act of following a calm, predictable pattern have helped soothe the minds of those who were otherwise consumed by the chaos of daily life? While we may never know for certain, the rise of these evening rituals does reflect the broader Victorian obsession with control and order, even in something as seemingly uncontrollable as sleep. Perhaps it was this very attempt to bring structure to an unpredictable world that offered a sense of comfort and calm to those suffering from sleepless nights. Now let's take a look at some of the truly bizarre gadgets that emerged in the Victorian era, all designed with the single goal of promoting better sleep. The Victorians, with their fascination for invention and engineering, created all kinds of medical contraptions to address insomnia. Some of these devices were meant to stimulate the body, others to regulate the environment, but all shared the same goal: getting a better night's rest. These gadgets were often marketed as medical miracles, promising to deliver instant relaxation and cure the woes of sleeplessness. One of the most unusual gadgets was the sleeping mask or sleeping hood. These were not the soft, comfortable sleep masks we use today to block out light. No, these contraptions were heavy, sometimes padded, and often covered the entire face. They were designed to help the sleeper by restricting the movement of the eyes and face, thus encouraging total relaxation. The idea was that by immobilizing the facial muscles, these masks would promote a deep, undisturbed sleep. Of course, the reality was more likely that people found these masks uncomfortable and claustrophobic rather than relaxing, but they were, nevertheless, a popular item for those who wanted to try anything in the search for a cure. Another favorite sleep gadget was the head and neck massager. This peculiar device was essentially a metal contraption that would be placed on the head or neck and gently vibrate, supposedly soothing away tension and encouraging a more restful sleep. The Victorian obsession with massage as a remedy for stress and sleeplessness led to the creation of several variations of these massagers, some of which were battery-powered, though the term battery-powered in the Victorian era likely referred to something far less reliable than modern technology. The idea was that the gentle vibrations would loosen up the neck and shoulder muscles, relax the mind, and most importantly, help the patient drift off to sleep. Historians still argue whether these sleep gadgets were genuinely effective, or if they were simply part of the larger trend of Victorian gadgetry and novelty. Some modern experts suggest that while these devices may not have provided long-lasting relief from insomnia, they could have helped in the short term by promoting relaxation or distraction. But more often than not, these gadgets were simply ways to capitalize on the public's growing interest in finding an instant fix to their problems. Today, they serve as curious relics of a time when the search for a good night's sleep was a serious endeavor that involved both medical professionals and amateur inventors. Despite the oddity of these devices, they represent the Victorian era's approach to solving problems. When faced with a widespread issue like insomnia, Victorians didn't just rely on traditional medicine. They were eager to find innovative solutions, no matter how unusual or impractical. In a way, these sleep gadgets symbolize the lengths to which people would go in their attempt to reclaim control over something as fundamental as rest. And while they might seem laughable to us now, they were part of an era that truly believed in the power of invention to fix everything, even sleep. As we approach the end of this peculiar journey through Victorian sleep remedies, it's time to look at some of the most forgotten and perhaps strangest sleep aids that emerged during the period. While the more famous treatments like opium or lavender are well known, some of the lesser-known remedies used by the Victorians are even more fascinating. These obscure treatments, many of which have faded into the history books, were just as bizarre as they were ineffective. But for those suffering from insomnia in the 19th century, these forgotten aids were seen as their last hope for rest. One such remedy was the use of animal-infused potions. Yes, you read that right. Victorians sometimes turned to animal-derived ingredients to help them sleep. One particularly strange concoction involved the use of crocodile dung, which was believed to possess magical properties that could induce sleep. It sounds like something out of a medieval herbalist's journal, but crocodile dung was used in various tinctures and tonics. It's still unclear what the Victorians thought it did, but the idea was that it would soothe the nerves and help those suffering from insomnia drift off. It's hard to imagine what anyone found soothing about crocodile dung, but in a world with few reliable medical options, these odd treatments were given serious consideration. Another peculiar sleep aid was sleep-inducing pillows, which were designed with specific herbs and scents sewn into the fabric. These pillows often contained a blend of lavender, valerian, or even rose petals, and were meant to be pressed against the face as a person lay down to sleep. The scent of these herbs, the Victorians believed, would calm the mind and help bring on sleep. While this may sound similar to the use of lavender sachets today, these pillows were much more elaborate. Some even had compartments for tiny bags of powdered substances, meant to be inhaled while sleeping. The idea was that the combination of soothing aromas and gentle pressure from the pillow would induce a deeper sleep. Historians still debate whether these animal-based remedies or herbal-infused pillows had any real effect. It's easy to dismiss these as mere superstition or placebo, but in a world where sleep disorders were poorly understood and treated with dubious methods, it's not surprising that people would turn to such oddities. These forgotten sleep aids reflect the Victorian obsession with curing insomnia at any cost. Whether it was crocodile dung, sleep-inducing pillows, or any of the other strange treatments, the Victorians were willing to try anything to combat sleeplessness. As we close this chapter on the Victorian struggle for sleep, one thing becomes clear: the lengths they went to in the name of rest were extraordinary. They faced the same human need for sleep that we do today, but their understanding of how to achieve it was, at best, rudimentary. Yet, in their attempts to find relief, the Victorians created a fascinating and bizarre array of remedies, some of which we can only look back on with awe and disbelief. Today, we may chuckle at the idea of a crocodile dung sleeping potion or a vibrating head massager, but in the context of their time, these were cutting-edge solutions. So, the next time you struggle to get a good night's sleep, remember that you're not alone. People have been battling insomnia for centuries, and their solutions may have been strange, but their desperation for rest was as real as yours.